A very warm welcome, everybody, to this regional opening event of the Race to Resilience Asia event series. My name is Jasper Hilkhuizen, and I will be your MC for today. This opening is the first out of a total of 7 events throughout this week, building up to COP27. Throughout the event, please feel free to post any questions you have for our speakers in the chat box, as there will be time during the panel discussion to address some of them. Now, without further ado, I'll pass the virtual floor to Michael Kwok, Arab's East Asia Region Chair, to officially launch the series. Mr. Kwok, over to you.
Dear Mr. CWJ, Secretary for Environment and Ecology, Hong Kong SAR, Professor Christine, Mr. Ramiro Fernandez, Ms. Noreen Sokin, Dame Jody Silva, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to this regional opening event of the Race to Resilient Asia event series. 1 year ago, 2 weeks before COP26 took place in Glasgow in 2022, we organized the Race to Zero event series. The overarching message was to call for action at all levels and to all stakeholders of the built environment to upscale decarbonization efforts. While the race to zero must continue, we urgently need to adapt and brace ourselves for what we cannot prevent. The race to resilience has started. COP27 is fast approaching. In less than a week, global country leaders will meet in the Egyptian coastal city of Sharm el-Sheikh. The formal outcomes of COP26 request countries to revisit and strengthen their climate pledge by end of 2022. COP27 will be a key milestone in moving from mitigation to adaptation as nations work together on defining global goals and translate into measurable outcomes, in particularly around 3 key themes: decarbonization of cities, sustainable energy, and resilience. As an industry leader in sustainable development and resilient buildings, Arab recognizes the importance of maximizing multi-stakeholders engagement and cross-sectoral collaboration. Hence, we see the need and are proud to once again organize an event series in the run-up to COP27. Home to some of the world's most densely populated coastal cities, extreme event-prone cities, and low-lying inhabited islands, Asia is acutely affected by the increased intensity and frequency of extreme heat, weather disasters, and rise in sea levels. Consequently, it is crucial for the region to adapt, address post-disaster recovery, and build a resilient world where we do not just survive climate shocks and stresses, but thrive despite them. With over 30 strategic partners and supporting organizations, the series takes place across 6 major cities in Asia, include Ho Chi Minh City, Hong Kong, Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, Manila, and Singapore. It will feature over 25 renowned experts to share their insights and experience. Together, we will generate practical actions to fight climate change and build resilience for future generations. Today's event marked the opening of the series, and during the rest of the week, we will take a city system approach to look at issues pertaining to each hosting city, ranging from energy and water to transport and inclusive design. I would like to take the opportunity to thank all the series strategic partners and supporting organizations, as well as speakers, for their great support. I hope you enjoy this and the subsequent sessions. Unity and strength through exchange and partnership. Let's work together to create great resilience and build a more sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kwok. I'm honored to now pass the virtual floor to Ramiro Fernandez, who is the UNFCCC Climate Champions Campaigns Director. Mr. Fernandez, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jasper, and thank you very much, Arup, for setting up these Race to Resilience series dialogues just before the COP, as you mentioned. I'm honored and thrilled to be here with you. And as Michael was just saying, we are seeing the impacts of climate change already happening over the world. During this year, we have extreme record temperatures in 3 regions in the world at the same time happening. In Asia, Europe, and America, all the 3 at the same time with extreme record temperatures events. What we're seeing in Pakistan these days, with more than 30 million people displaced and more than 1.7 million people dying because of the recent floods, are nothing else than reinforcing the relevance and importance for us to strengthen our actions on adaptation and resilience. The high-level champions, they launched Race to Resilience campaign back in early 2021 with the aim and the goal to give resilience and adaptation the same level of attention and relevance under the UNFCCC climate negotiations that it has on mitigation has for many years. With this campaign, putting people at the center, we designed a shared goal to protect 4 billion people by 2030. And to do this, by developing a metric framework and a way in which people can start measuring how they're truly having impact and contributing to protecting these people and enhancing resilience all over the world. Today, we have more than 36 partners that represent over 2,000 organizations in more than 116 countries. And together, these organizations had set out the goal for themselves to collectively protect 2.9 billion people by 2030. We're starting this work and this effort to give adaptation and resilience measurable ways to show collectively how we're stepping up to protect the people that is more needed. And to, as Michael said, not just to survive to the impacts of climate change we cannot avoid anymore, but to thrive in spite of them on the way forward. This is our vision and our aim on Race to Resilience. And I'm really pleased to have these dialogues in the Asia region these days. We've encouraged many of the organizations to join Race to Resilience and together show the world and show national governments how we can address climate change, measure our impact, and contribute to this very much needed global goal on adaptation. Thank you very much for this series.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fernandez. I will now move on to our panel discussion, moderated by Professor Christine Lowe, who is the Chief Development Strategist at the Institute for the Environment of the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. She's a former Undersecretary for the Environment at the Hong Kong SCR government and a former legislator. Professor Lowe, over to you.
Hello. Thank you very much for inviting me to convene this particular panel discussion. I can only really add 2 points to what Mr. Kwok and Mr. Fernandez have said. I think the first thing is adaptation and resilience have been like the poor sisters when we put it next to mitigation. But I think we've come to a time where Mr. Fernandez reminds us that we can no longer do that because actually severe and extreme weather is now upon us. And people recognize that we must do as much as we're doing on mitigation in terms of dealing with making our societies and our cities more robust and resilient. The second point I wish to make is Mr. Fernandez and Mr. Kwok both kind of described some of the extreme weather that we have experienced in different parts of the world. Well, if we think it's bad now, actually, as we go forward, as the globe continues to warm, things could get even worse. So that means we can go from where we are today, but if we stretch it forward, the weather could be even more extreme and even more severe. And that is a very good reason for us to actually pay a lot more attention to climate adaptation and resilience. Now, I'm extremely privileged today to moderate this panel discussion with 3 excellent speakers. So let me call upon the first speaker to present. Each one of them will share 5 slides, a few minutes with us just to frame the discussion. And then we will start a discussion amongst the panelists. And as Jasper reminded everybody at the beginning, you will have a chance to ask questions and you can type in your questions. So Joe, may I hand over to you? And Joe is the Arab's Global Sustainable Development Leader.
Thank you, Christine. It's a real pleasure to be here and contribute to this really important series. A year ago, I was in Glasgow at COP26, and there the focus was very much on raising ambition to rapidly reduce emissions. But the reality is that over the past year, emissions are rising. And on the current trajectory, we're going to overshoot 1.5 degrees. And current policies are likely to see temperatures rise by as much as 2.7 degrees later this century. What this means has been described as a code red for humanity. COP27 needs to focus on action, tangible, practical, and relevant solutions that not only accelerate decarbonisation, but also build resilience. We're already seeing the catastrophic consequences of the climate crisis, floods and wildfires. And at New York Climate Week last month, almost every speaker was noticing that climate change is happening wherever they're living in the world. To put climate change into context, climate change impacts are projected to cost the global economy $54 trillion by 2040. And by comparison, the pandemic has caused only $2.7 trillion in economic damage. But I think it's important to remember that loss isn't just measured in economic terms. It's also about loss of life and livelihoods, as we've seen so starkly in Pakistan recently. So adaptation and resilience are becoming essential, and particularly so in the cities in the world, where urban planning, infrastructure and investment decisions and business strategies have to take account of the future climate. Next. Resilience has been very much at the center of my work for 15 years. I started exploring what contributes to the resilience of cities in Asia in 2008 as part of an initiative led by the Rockefeller Foundation. One of the things that I'm very clear on is that relative to mitigation, resilience is really complex. Mitigating climate change is about one thing. It's about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, whereas resilience is the outcome of many, many factors. The City Resilience Index, which we developed some years ago and has been used in 100 and more cities around the world, highlights this. It recognizes that resilience depends on everyone's health and well-being. That's about safe housing, access to water, energy, sanitation, healthcare, livelihoods. And so resilience can't be divorced from tackling urban poverty and improving services and protection to those living on marginal land. Resilience relies on infrastructure that provides the essential services on which we all depend. And it relies on that infrastructure continuing to function even as temperatures rise and precipitation patterns change. Mangroves and seawalls are essential to protect communities. Transport and communication systems need to be able to continue to enable the flow of goods and services and people. And all of this is only possible with good leadership and informed decisions that are based on robust data. We also need empowered citizens and integrated planning processes. And the formal and informal networks that underpin society and the economy, including finance, justice, and culture, are also vital to enable communities to act collectively at times of stress. The diversity of these factors means that not only governments, but also real estate and utility companies have a role to play. And I'm just going to give you a few examples. Next. Adaptation and resilience are strategies that improve the ability of communities and businesses to survive and thrive the impacts of climate change. It's about anticipating the future and being able to withstand, respond, and recover whatever happens. Our ability to do so relies on all the services that underpin modern life. And the most critical of these is energy supply. Our ability to reach net zero by 2050 relies on electrification of the energy supply and switching to renewables. But we also need to make sure that that energy supply is not just sustainable, but it's also resilient. And that's a challenge because within cities, energy systems are facing growing demand, particularly from electric vehicles and buses and light rail, as well as having to think about the risks associated from overheating and flooding. Blackouts threaten business continuity, but they can also be life-threatening if they go on for extended periods, so that people, particularly the elderly or the young, are without cooling or elevators, ability to cook or lighting. So the trilemma for energy companies is affordability and sustainability, but also resilience. How do they enable their networks to respond to surges in demand for cooling due to extreme temperatures or deal with flooding? And so they need strategies that enable them to prevent failure, expedite recovery, and transform performance. This slide shows a framework that we developed for the national grid in the UK, but we're doing very similar work at the moment in New York, looking at their system and making sure that the physical network is robust and includes redundancy, but also that the organization is able to be responsive. And that depends on leadership and empowered staff. And it also relies on their supply chains and the availability of finance. Next. We not only need to look businesses are also seen as an important part of addressing climate change. And their concern is largely avoiding stranded assets. The global economy can't afford businesses to fail en masse. And whilst most businesses have made commitments to decarbonisation, their ability to meet those commitments over the next decade will depend on navigating a rapidly changing policy landscape, green finance and energy transition that is driving decarbonisation. These transition risks pose a short to medium-term threat to business, but longer term, the big issue is physical exposure to climate impacts, and that is their growing concern. In the UK, the Building Better Partnership are promoting climate resilient strategies that bring together mitigation, adaptation, and disclosure through the Task Force for Climate Finance Disclosure. Their argument, which I fully support, is that we have to think about mitigation and adaptation and disclosure in one breath. Unless we all contribute to global mitigation efforts, businesses will have increasing likelihood of having to deal with physical climate impacts on their buildings and their value chains, which pose a threat to their normal operations. But also, by reducing the exposure of businesses to carbon-intensive activities, they're likely to avoid the impacts of rapidly changing policy. And by anticipating climate impacts in the future, they're able to prevent major financial losses and prevent damage or harm to people or the environment. It's not just businesses, it's also industry that relies on supply chains. We saw through COVID how severe the impact of disrupted supply chains are. And that's thrown a spotlight onto the very important role played by global shipping and ports. Efforts to decarbonize shipping by switching to hydrogen are ongoing, and that's going to require significant changes to the design and management of ports. But those same ports are exposed to changes in sea level and vulnerable to storms. Resilience for Ports is a multi-stakeholder, whole systems initiative which we're working on, which is about enhancing the resilience of ports, recognizing that they're a nexus of critical infrastructure systems. This initiative has been working with the global ports industry to look at the impact of decarbonization, technology change, and climate change all together. The project has brought together the whole value chain, and that's what's important. It includes financiers to operators, policymakers to shipping companies. And together, they've been developing an approach to resilience that's directly linked to the Race to the Resilience's UN breakthrough agendas. Next. I wanted to end by talking about the importance of nature-based solutions. One of the big changes at COP was that nature-based solutions are now increasingly becoming recognized as absolutely critical to resilience. For too long, urban development hasn't taken account of the services nature provides, its ability to reduce temperature, absorb carbon, and attenuate water. Asia's led the way in pioneering sponge cities designed to soak up and to store water, and they're becoming an accepted strategy to improve resilience. By using machine learning and satellite data, we've recently been able to use this at scale in Shanghai. And Shanghai, as you know, is a city of over 24 million people. And its original drainage plan, developed a decade ago, used only grey infrastructure. And there was going to be a cost of about 43 billion to install tunnels, detention tanks, and stormwater treatment plants. But by analysing the city using satellite data, we'll be able to harness the power of nature, the ability of the city and all the green and blue spaces in it to absorb extreme water. And then that could be supplemented by a much more limited amount of grey infrastructure. These are just a few examples of the way in which adaptation and resilience is being tackled in cities at a city scale and by businesses at an individual asset scale. I think the most important thing is that everybody has a role to play in this, whether it's individual businesses or local governments or non-governmental organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. Can I invite Lauren Sorkin, who's the Executive Director of Resilient Cities Network, to share her views with us?
Thank you, Christine. And it's such a pleasure to be here and to speak to all of you from Singapore this afternoon. I really can't imagine a more important way to be kicking off this week than with a real focus on resilience. It's been said a number of times in different ways by the colleagues on this panel, but the climate challenges that we face are not equal in terms of where their impacts are felt. And in this region, we know that we have 98 of the most vulnerable 100 cities on the planet when it comes to not just climate, but the multiple hazards that cities are facing. So when we talk about what we have to do to face up to the climate crisis, resilience building is essential. When we talk about the imperative to invest in resilience, we often talk about this false dichotomy between mitigation and adaptation. And there is a need for us to join up these conversations and look for the best possible opportunities to bring together climate finance that accomplishes multiple goals or multiple benefits. And I think as we start this discussion, it's very important to speak about the frameworks. And Jo mentioned this in her presentation as well. When we look at resilience, we look at what it will take for individuals, for communities, for businesses, and for cities and systems to thrive. And when we take this kind of holistic view of how we approach climate resilience, we can find ways to overcome the limitations in how we are financing and really address this issue head on. When you look at this, when you look at these numbers that you see here on the slide, what you see is that less than 10% of climate finance today is going into what is considered adaptation and the kinds of initiatives that are going to protect populations from certain climate impacts. And this is something that we really have to address immediately, because while we are mitigating, we have to adapt and we have to find those kinds of joined up opportunities to address these issues. When you look at the issues that we're facing in terms of resilience, they are very common between our different geographies, and there are patterns in how we can invest. So when we look at what the most common impacts that we're facing, whether they be extreme precipitation, storms and wind, flood risk, and then we look at the kinds of infrastructure we need to build better to protect ourselves from the floods, the storms and wind, and the opportunities to mitigate emissions from those same assets, we have a tremendous opportunity. So what we see right now is this challenge of climate finance is something that we can bring to bear as an opportunity if we look at it in a joined up way. And that's really at its core. One of the most important messages that in this week, in this next month of discussions and negotiations on climate, we have to get right. That is what we're racing towards. We are racing towards that increase in joined up thinking and joined up investment. Next slide. Now, in order to achieve that kind of joined up thinking, we have to start with the same frameworks and the same definitions of what we are trying to do. I mentioned that resilience at its core is our ability from the individual level to systems level to survive, adapt, and grow, no matter what kind of chronic stress or acute shock is being faced in a place. In essence, we have to understand both these long-term impacts of our climate stress, as well as how they're going to interact with those acute shocks that are going to occur in our system, that flash flood or that heat wave, and how that's going to interact with the nature of our infrastructure, the nature of those longer term stresses that we're facing, whether we have a growing city or a shrinking city, whether we have a city that is investing and needs to protect a growing and aging population, or whether we have a very young or many migrants in our population. We need to be aware of the interaction of those two. And so our frameworks enable us to do that. Now, when we are able to look and share those frameworks and definitions, we can plan holistically over the long term. And this is the other piece that's really essential. When we look at our cities and we look at how we are planning and investing, we have to both take a holistic and shared framework, and we have to take that long-term view. We have to be able to plan our infrastructure, our capital for the long-term in place. Next slide, please. Now, in the Resilient Cities Network, we have been working for almost 10 years across a network of 100 cities to build holistic resilience. And there are two key elements in that recipe for success. The first I have just spoken to, which is having a shared definition, a shared framework, and a long-term view. The second is really about human capital. In order to be successful in building hard infrastructure, we need the soft skills and we need the human capacity in place, not just to mitigate risk, but to manage resilience and to actually invest in resilience. In the Resilient Cities Network, we have within each and every one of our cities a very special position. And that position was originally modeled off of the position of a chief risk officer in a corporation, someone whose job it was to think day in, day out about the future and how your city will manage its risk and its opportunities in a holistic way so that you can survive, adapt, and thrive. And so chief resilience officers take on this bold and important role of leading and coordinating, developing their city's plans and making sure that those plans turn into actions and investments. And having that centralized role and capacity and building connections through a city, building capacity through a city to manage the changes that are coming in terms of the climate and in terms of other shocks and stresses in a joined up way allows those cities to better weather the storms that are coming. Next slide, please. Now, the result of joined up thinking, planning, and having the capacity is projects. But we see that there is a big gap between the kinds of projects that are initiated, that are conceptualized, and those that at this time are attracting funding. And I spoke to this in the first slide. At this point, we are seeing most of climate finance gravitating towards mitigation projects. And much of this is because there is a need for better, more holistic, and more intentional project preparation. And so something that we have done quite a bit in our network of resilient cities is break down individual issue areas and bring a resilience approach, a holistic approach to project preparation, beginning with resilience assessment, which really looks at how we assess risk and vulnerability in a place-based way, identifying the projects that are going to maximize the opportunities to reduce vulnerability and achieve climate and economic benefits, and then carry those principles and carry those design elements through into project development, and then match those with the right kinds of technical skills and funding that enable those projects to happen in a holistic way. That process, going from idea to project implementation and integrating those joined up principles, is essential if we're going to be able to mobilize investment. Next slide. Last, I wanted to give one example of one of these joined up projects. I want to talk about this project not just because it is a project that focuses on resilience, but because it's so inherently scalable. This project is a water square, which is pictured in Surat in India. The design of the square was inspired by the city of Rotterdam, which also designs water squares that, as you see in the top, provide a place for people to gather and recreate and build social capital, build connection to one another in good times. Then in times of stress, in times of flood, they are able to capture water. These kinds of simple and replicable projects can be scaled across many cities facing the same issues. And I think I want to end just by saying that while our cities may be one of our greatest risks, they are also our greatest opportunity. Their ability to create change at scale is very inspiring, and I'm looking forward to talking more about that in the panel as we're all racing to resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. May I invite C.W. Che, the Secretary for the Environment in the HKSAR government in Hong Kong, for his presentation.
Thank you, Christine and others. Well, like other cities, Hong Kong is facing problems such as rising temperatures and more extreme weather phenomenon, including super typhoons, intensive rainstorms, and storm surges. Those who may not know the climate action plan for Hong Kong, I would like to spend a few minutes to talk about it. Yeah, and the target to strive to achieve carbon neutrality before 2050 and reduce Hong Kong's total carbon emissions from the 2005 level by half before 2035. Indeed, in terms of carbon emissions for Hong Kong peak at 2014. And as of today, compared to the peak levels due to our efforts made in the past, the carbon emissions per capita has reduced by about 30%. I think in terms of absolute, it has been reduced by about 20% already. Yeah, and our next target is to reduce it by half before 2035, and then carbon neutrality before 2050. Well, to achieve these goals, last year, we published the Hong Kong's Climate Action Plan 2050. Under the plan, we set out in detail 4 major decarbonization strategies, namely, net zero electricity generation, energy savings and green buildings, green transport, and waste reduction. You may wonder why waste reduction is also a key strategy in order to achieve carbon neutrality. It's because Hong Kong, we still rely on landfills to handle our domestic waste. And those domestic waste in the landfills, they will decay and emit methane, which is a very strong greenhouse gases. And therefore, we have set a target to phase out landfilling in Hong Kong by 2035. And then we'll leave for sufficient time for those waste in the landfills to decay and for all those the thing to come out. And therefore, waste reduction is also an important strategy in Hong Kong in order to achieve carbon neutrality. Yeah. And in the next 20 years or so, the government was prepared to devote about 240 billion Hong Kong dollars to take forward various measures to mitigate and adapt to climate change, including energy saving, renewable energy, green transport, waste to energy facilities, strengthening coastal defenses, stabilizing slopes, and drainage improvement works, etc., etc. Right. Well, in order, to achieve our carbon neutrality, our chief executive has set up a coordination group, pulling together all the policy secretaries and different bureaus and departments to champion various measures in order to decarbonize Hong Kong. And on adaptation, it was set up a climate change working group on infrastructure under the leadership of the Civil Engineering and Development Department. Yeah, and that working group is passed to study the potential effects of various climate changes effects, including extreme temperatures, extreme storm surges, and super typhoon on all government critical infrastructure. And they need to identify where the risks are, as well as identify the mitigating measures required in order to adapt to that sort of change. They are also reviewing on the design standards in the light of the latest developments in climate science, international standards. Yeah, and at the moment, Hong Kong, we are planning to develop two large-scale new towns. One is we call it Land Town Tomorrow, which will be a large reclamation to build an artificial island and then put about 1.2 million people on that island, and that is being planned. And one major task is for Civil Engineering Department to look at the design standards for that project in order to achieve first what is a low carbon city, and the second is how to adapt to the potential climate change effects. And therefore, they are working on the design standards required for the new town, etc. And the other is a northern metropolis being planned for Hong Kong, and other a large-scale new town development, which will it is being planned to house over 2 million people. Yeah, again, the government is determined to develop that new town, new city into a low carbon green development city, as well as look at all the adaptation requirements. Yeah, and actually we are still at the early stage of looking at adaptation, but the work of the working group on infrastructure has not been completed yet. Yeah, many of those studies are still ongoing, and therefore we look for more recommendations and concrete plans coming out from that study group in future. Next. And this is a small example. That is a breakwater in Hong Kong at the Aberdeen area. And this Aberdeen South breakwater at the head portion was a place where specifically designed the precast concrete units in 2019 for enhancing climate resilience. 1.1 meter high wave wall was built on top of the existing breakwaters, were provided in stages in 2020 to 2021. And therefore you can see that in this picture. Yes, it's just a small example, but we are beginning to take sea level rise as well as extreme weather into consideration into our design, and then we also will add on the new structure required in order to stand for the change. Yeah. Next. Yeah. And on the top of it, well, it's a large underground stormwater storage facility. It's built at Happy Valley. Yeah, on top of it, well, it's basically the horse race ground. Yeah. And underneath it is a large-scale stormwater storage area with a capacity of 60,000 cubic meters, equivalent to 24 standard swimming pools. Yeah, and that will help to avoid flooding. Yeah, and indeed, I think around 20 years ago, Hong Kong, we have over 100 flooding black spots. And because of similar or not necessarily a storm water storage scheme, we have other drainage improvement schemes, etc. As of today, while the number of flooding black spots has reduced to 4 in Hong Kong, and therefore we have been working hard on it, and we'll continue to improve the drainage system and to make the city safer against heavy rainstorms. Yeah, and the other is to combat extreme heat. And while we are promoting urban forestry and tree planting to lower urban temperature, as well as to reduce the heat island effect. Yeah, and for those who have visited Hong Kong, say 20 years ago, we will have a same opinion. We have many more trees in our urban area. Yeah, and which is actually purpose will build. One objective is to reduce the heat island effect. Yeah, and also we are reviewing the technical requirements from thermal expansion joints of building components in order to cope with extreme temperature and all other and others. Yeah, next. Yeah, on resilience, Hong Kong government, we have a contingency plan, to tackle various natural disasters. We have set up an interdepartmental steering committee chaired by the Chief Secretary for Administration to handle substantial natural disasters. Yeah, and under that contingency plan, we have a comprehensive warning and monitoring system so that we can establish early alert systems in areas vulnerable to flooding, as well as to disseminate message to all the other users in the city. Yeah, and we have also set up a contingency plan for the transport system so that we can handle various emergency situations at major transport infrastructure. Yeah. But nonetheless, have I mentioned, adaptation is a new issue to the city. Yeah, and therefore, we have only very limited experience on it, and we have just for that, working group on infrastructure has been set up only for 2 years, and we're still carrying out a number of studies. Yeah, and at the same time, we have been talking to different utility companies in the city, including the power companies, the bus company, etc. Again, setting up their own contingency plans to tackle extreme weather and also other effects that may be brought about by climate change. And through this, today's event, I look forward to learning from others on what more we can do in the years to come. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We only have about 15 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is really ask all of you to pick one of the subjects. Now, what I got from the 3 speakers is you mentioned a number of cities. There was London, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and a particular case in India. The commonality was really about dealing with water, the idea of sponge city, and in Hong Kong is called blue-green infrastructure. Then Joe highlighted ports, and of course, Hong Kong and Singapore are 2 of the largest ports in the world, so we might touch on that. And then, of course, we talked about money. So the issue about money is, it seems to me that actually adaptation investments it's really investing in a public good, isn't it? So the question that Lauren put out, which is that only 10% of the investments are going into climate adaptation, is it that we expect government to do it and the private investors really have no role. So perhaps of these issues that you all brought up, may I ask each one of you to say a few words, because I'm looking at the clock and we have about 12 minutes left. So Joe, may I ask you to expand on one of those issues?
Thank you, Christine. Absolutely. And I think, your last point about finance is perhaps the most salient issue. Climate finance is only a small proportion of the overall finance in the world. The majority of finance goes into significant infrastructure investment, the types of programs that Mr. Say is talking about. And we need to make sure that all investment in infrastructure ensures that it is contributing to a net zero future and that it's contributing to the resilience of the communities that infrastructure serves. And so that's a mind shift in terms of thinking about what are those investments for. We can do specific investments to solve individual problems, but what we need to make sure is that every investment tackles the two biggest issues we face. One, getting to that net zero future as soon as we possibly can. And secondly, improving the resilience of communities who are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. I do just want to highlight one more thing from my presentation, which was the theme of the importance of data and digital technology. All of the interventions that Mr. Say presented, that Lauren Sorkin presented, start with actually understanding to our best ability what the future climate will look like. And that is one of the most important things. If we're going to build resilience, we have to think about the future and move away from where we've been, which is designing infrastructure and designing cities based on historical weather data and not taking account of the weather that is coming around the corner.
Joe, thank you. Now, obviously, there's a great interest in this panel, but I've just been given the permission to go on for another 10 minutes because I think the audience wants to hear what you have to say. So given that, maybe, Joe, I can just press you on one point. You mentioned that the maritime sector, the shipping sector, is having to look at new fuels, and you talked about hydrogen. Isn't it very difficult for cities and for planners, because the issue about which is the future fuel for ships has not actually been decided? So some people might be looking at hydrogen, some people might be looking at ammonia, and then there is even small nuclear power, all kinds of things. So how realistic is it for port cities to really deal with this issue at this stage?
I think the challenge for port cities and for most companies, whether they're public or private sector, is actually understanding the pace of change and what is happening up and down the value chain. So ports are designed to receive a particular type of ships, to refuel those ships, to offload that ships. The ports need to have a much more intimate relationship with the shipping companies. They also need a much more intimate relationship with the rail networks and the road networks that take goods from the ports and distribute those to communities. What we've seen through our work is that actually the industry is very fragmented. And one of the things that Ports for Resilience achieved is actually bringing together people who wouldn't normally meet to have those conversations, and so that people working on the design and operation of ports can actually talk directly to the people thinking about decarbonisation of shipping and ask those difficult questions. When is this going to happen? And I talked about seaports, but of course we're in exactly the same position with airports, and the fact that aviation will need to transition in the future away from reliance on fossil fuels. The question is how fast, and how is that going to change the aviation industry? Will it mean that actually we move away from very long haul flights to maybe shorter haul flights? And when it comes to introducing new technologies, such as hydrogen, the implications in terms of safety considerations are significant, but also it changes the role of ports because perhaps they become an energy hub in a city in a way that they haven't before. So I think the big issue for everybody is really recognizing the scale of transformation that is required in the infrastructure that underpins our lives. We've got used to incremental change, but actually what we're finding is that a lot of critical infrastructure providers are really thinking very strategically about how do we look at this through the lens of transformational change, not just taking small actions, but saying, how do we completely rethink the infrastructure we're providing to deal with a very, very different future when it comes to the climate and weather we're going to experience.
Now, Lauren and CW, there are actually two questions for you. So I'm going to ask the questions from the audience, and then you can decide how you want to deal with it. So Lauren, you've been asked, amongst all the cities that you know about, can you give a couple of examples of which you think are the most encouraging, the best ones? And CW, you have a question from a member of the audience to say, Hong Kong is doing all these things that you've presented. Is there something, or maybe more than one thing, that you think could be good examples for other cities? So Lauren, please.
Thank you, Christine. There are a number of leading cities around the world. If you look at North America, you can point to a lot of the actions that Miami is taking in a regional sense to build resilience, and that New York has taken post-Sandy to combine hard and soft infrastructure. If you look over at Africa, you can look at what Cape Town has done around water resilience as a really fantastic example of what they're focusing on. And when you look at Europe, you can look at Rotterdam as a port city, and you can look at Paris as a city that's dealing with heat, social equity, and nature-based solutions in a really proactive way. But I want to really focus on a city that's emerging, because I think what's really important in the conversation is to think about cities that are growing very fast, that have a high level of vulnerability, and what they can teach us. Because there are a lot of areas where, yes, joined up private sector investment and collaboration can do phenomenal things. And there are others where we still need to really focus on building the capacity of our public sector to engage that capacity and to direct it in the right direction. And I think where we've seen that happen in a very, very inspiring way, in addition to Surat, is actually in Semarang. And we have seen a city which is a smaller city with respect to Jakarta or Bangkok, but still a very fast growing city that has an opportunity to change the shape of its infrastructure plan. And what they've done that's been very inspiring is they've embedded resilience in their planning department, and they've actually set up infrastructure investments to change their transportation systems to be both low carbon and more mindful of resilience challenges like floods and aging population. So I think where we see the most inspiration is in three areas. Those cities that first and foremost invest in the human capital and they embed it in their planning systems, as Semarang has, as Surat has, and as many of the other cities I mentioned have. Then they take their resilience shocks and stresses and they use them as a framework for investment planning. And they actually embed that in their capital plans, in their budgets, and they measure the success of their implementation according to both how much greenhouse gas they are mitigating as well as the specific populations that they protect. And so I think that's where we see the leadership, where it becomes something that is a capacity that's valued in staff, that it's something that is embedded in project planning, and that it's measured in project implementation.
Thank you. CW, what impressed you most about Hong Kong, and what would you recommend to other cities?
Well, as I've mentioned, actually, we are still at the early stage of tackling the adaptation subject. Yeah, And also, I believe for every city, well, we will have to look for their own solutions because of the different settings, different geographical situation, etc. Yeah, I think maybe the most useful experience that we, the government, we have set up a working group specifically tasked to look at the different critical infrastructure of Hong Kong and evaluate whether they can stand, say, for extreme weather, extreme wind speed, extreme heat, rainfall, etc. And then what sort of improvement will be required, as well as to review in the long term what should be the design standards for reclamations for our building structures, etc. And those for design standards, and then we'll have all the new buildings, new infrastructures for stand for extreme weather, etc. Maybe one thing I would recommend all cities to do is that set up a committee, pull together the experts, look at your risk, and then derive the solutions and the long-term standards required for all the new building infrastructures. That will help. Yeah.
Well, I have one last question, and we have about 4 minutes. So if we can have about 1.5 minutes each from you for the last round, that would be excellent. And the question is, particularly in Asia, we have a lot of pressure on density of people. And how do you deal with the contradiction between the density of people, need for dealing with the density, and putting in, blue-green infrastructure and redesigning and nature-based solutions? Perhaps, Joe, you can go first.
Hi. Well, I think Lauren's example of the water squares in Surat was, a hard landscaping example of being able to create sort of public space and attenuate water. But of course, that's true in terms of landscaped areas in cities too. And we tend to think about those landscaped areas being on the ground. But of course, we've got a lot of roof spaces on buildings, not necessarily the very, very tall buildings, but certainly low and medium rise buildings. And those roofscapes can be made into green spaces that have amenity value for people. And there are really, really good examples of that already happening in European cities in particular. But also last time I was in Hong Kong,
very short, Joe,
I had the pleasure. Last time I was in Hong Kong, I was able to visit the Happy Valley underground stormwater storage. And that's an example of providing the resilience measures, but without taking away a really important amenity for the city. So I think the message is it is doable, and some cities are doing it. It's a question of sharing those experiences so that everyone can do it.
Lauren, final comment in about 2 sentences, and same for CW. Lauren.
I would just say that we have a lot of spaces that we can use to make them greener and more absorptive. Schools are one, pathways are another. And I would also say that density isn't always a problem. Resilience is a team sport. So being in the proximity of many others and many different assets, we can also share. And sometimes we don't need to repeat as many of the buildings or services. And we can actually think about ways to retrofit, make those areas greener, cooler, and more absorptive and more resilient. Thanks.
Terrific. CW, last 30 seconds.
Well, density is a big challenge for Hong Kong. I think you all know that well. I just have 2 advice. One is to take care of the drainage system, and then the second is to promote urban forestry as much as you can. I think 2 adding together, I think will make our life easier. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. We've run out of time, and I think we could have more time. But thank you to the 3 panelists. Thank you to Arab, and for the other people who supported this great event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Low. And thank you also 3 panelists for a wonderfully rich and insightful discussion and presentations. Indeed, time unfortunately is too short, but luckily we have the rest of the week with more events coming up. So to close today's event and highlight what else is taking place the rest of this week, I'll now pass the virtual floor to Dr. Vincent Chang. He's the Director of Climate and Sustainability Services in East Asia at Arab. Dr. Chang, over to you.
Hello, everyone online. Thank you very much for joining us today. And of course, many thanks indeed to all the speakers, Joe, Lauren, CW, and our facilitator, Christine. I think for most of who do know that it's actually today is UN World City Day. I mean, we choose this day to kickstart our events is for this reasons, because the slogans of this year's World City Days is to act local and to grow global. And I believe to date, this message has been shared by many of our panelists. If there's one thing that is clear to me after these discussions, is that I think while we know the race to zero must continue, but the race to resilience is, I think, equally important and also critical. So both the challenges and solutions to climate mitigations and adaptations lie within our cities, as many of our panelists have raised. So it's only by bringing different partners and stakeholders together and share the experience, and I think more importantly, develop actions by empowering local and regional state and also non-state actors, will we be able to create a greener, more equitable and resilient, and I think above all, livable cities now and in the futures. And we hope that through this discussion today and also throughout the sessions that will be taking place during the rest of the week, we are contributing our own modest part to secure that future. So if you haven't signed up, please have a look at our event websites, and in subsequent sessions, we will have many knowledgeable thought leaders from 6 Asian cities, Hong Kong, Ho Chi Minh City, Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, and also Manila, to share more insights from the themes regarding to water, communities, mobilities, and energy resilience. So once again, thank you again for your participations, and we look forward to seeing you in the subsequent sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chang, and also thank you to all speakers throughout the session. Also, thank you for everyone attending the session online. Now, please note that the recording will be uploaded to the event webpage in due course, so you can re-watch and share this if you like to do so. Also, be reminded that our series is officially endorsed by the UNFCCC Climate Champions, and that you're encouraged to sign up your organization to the Race to Resilience and the Race to Zero, if you haven't done so yet. That's it for today. So we hope to see you during the session tomorrow and the rest of the week. And we hope that you have a very pleasant evening, morning, or afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you very much and hope to see you tomorrow.